Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Sarah, and welcome. As most of you probably know Aaron by now, he's our new protected areas manager. And since March, I guess, and outside of that, he's an expert birder who he worked for 5 years for the Muskoka Conservancy, and he's been a volunteer with the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. He currently holds the big day birding record for Muskoka, and yeah, he's here tonight to tell us all about birds. So without further ado, over to you, Aaron.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen and hopefully that all works out well. And put my presentation into full screen mode. Is that the correct thing you're seeing there, Sarah? Full screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, perfect. So as Sarah said, my presentation today will be on fall migration, specifically bird fall migration. There is some dragonfly and butterfly migration, but kind of figure birds are the more pertinent one at the moment. And I know it's a little bit late in fall to be talking about migration, but we still have kind of plenty of time left and wanted to share some tips as to how you can maximize your birding efficiency during fall migration. And so this photo right here is a photo of probably a portion of the flock of about, I don't know, 5,000 to 10,000 snow geese that we saw in Ottawa in November of 2 years ago, I think, on a hunt for another rare goose that showed up during the fall migration, a European tundra bean goose. And I wanted to show just kind of a scale of what you can see during fall migration, including out on the Georgian Bay coastline. It's a bit more difficult to have such, expansive numbers inland, but there's still plenty of opportunity to see a large number of birds, especially if you know where to look. So Sarah gave a brief intro of me. I just wanted to go into a few other points just to give you a history of kind of my experience with birding. I'm an avid birder and naturalist, and I use avid because obsessive sounds not as nice. I am birding pretty much anytime that I'm not working, including like nocturnal flight counts where I stay up until like 2 a.m. listening to birds flying overhead. But I'm also a naturalist, and I found as becoming a naturalist has really informed my birding and has helped inform my predictions about migration and what might happen during the year, because we see things like large cone crops influence the way finches move. You can see like large dragonfly hatches influencing how gulls and other birds that feed on them change their habits to kind of match some of those timings. So being a naturalist and a birder kind of go in hand in increasing your knowledge and understanding of the natural world. Like Sarah said, I currently hold the Muskoka Big Day record. I also hold the Muskoka Big Year record, which I set in 2020, I believe. I originally did a Muskoka Big Year in 2019 and set the record at the time at 212, and then proceeded to do, well, not intentionally do one the next year, but do it again next year. And I broke the record, setting it at 219. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because it shows just kind of a lack of understanding of how birds use Muskoka and the Georgian Bay landscape and where you might find them. Prior to me doing my first big year in 2019, we thought that 200 species in Muskoka was going to be challenging to beat. And 2019, I hit 212. 2020, I hit 219. 2021, I hit 215. And this year, I'm already at 217. So there's still a lot that we're learning about birds in the area. The Big Day record was previously set in 1996, and a big day is trying to see the most species of birds in a single 24 hours. And I set that with Eleanor Proctor, who's one of my coworkers and also a very good birder. And I have to give her huge props because I can't hear a couple warblers. They're a little too high pitched for me. And so she was the big helper in pinpointing those warblers. The record in 1996 was 127 species, and we beat it by one species, 128 species this year. To give you a sense of how important that one species is, the third, fourth, and fifth place are all sitting at 125 species. So one species makes a big difference. And then I do some volunteer work with both the Breeding Bird Atlas and Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program, which basically means that if you email me in June, you're you're going to have a delayed response because I am out in the field all day from 5 a.m. till 9 p.m. often. So now I'd like to get to kind of the meat of the topic about fall migration. And this little bird is called a Nelson's sparrow. This is a migrant that we only really see during fall migration and likes coastal marshes, likes bulrushes and cattails and shrubby grasses nearby them. You can see the really bright orange coloration. It's one of our few orange colored sparrows. But fall migration actually starts in July, which is usually like a peak summer cottaging month. And I always like to joke that my cottaging summer is June and my cottaging fall starts in July, and then ends in about November. Fall migration still kind of carries into November. There's still birds moving. I mean, we've seen birds migrating south until like mid-December, but the peak of the breeding or the migrating happens kind of prior to November. The interesting thing about fall migration that you don't see in spring migration is there are certain windows for groups of species. So in spring migration, a lot of birds just move north at the same time. So you can see sandpipers, you can see sparrows, you can see warblers all together. That's why we chose May as our time to break the big day record. That's why lots of birders go to Point Pelee and other areas, because there's lots of birds moving through. Whereas in fall, there's a lot more timing windows where certain species will be moving and others won't be. So fall migration is a little bit more difficult in that you can't just go wherever you'd like to see lots of birds. You can usually see lots of birds wherever you go, but there's some places you can kind of maximize your potential to see a lot of species. So our early migrants are dominated by shorebirds. And so shorebirds are kind of the reason why fall migration begins in July. They have this really interesting breeding cycle where they migrate north in May, they breed on the tundra, and then they migrate south. And they often do kind of like a circular route where they don't migrate along the same flight path in the spring and the fall. But the more interesting thing is, unlike many other birds, if they fail at their nesting, they just go south. So where cardinals and warblers and sparrows will try to have multiple broods, I've had cardinals in our yard with probably a third brood this year. Shorebirds, they try once and then they leave if it doesn't work. So if they don't find a mate, if their nest gets predated, for whatever reason, if they don't have any success breeding, they just fly south because they have such a short window, they don't have time to try again. So our shorebirds include both plovers and sandpipers. This guy right here is a ruddy turnstone. This one was photographed this year, most likely, I think, in start of August. And you can see that its plumage is kind of haphazard. In fall, many birds will molt their spring plumage and start a non-breeding plumage. Shorebirds and warblers kind of being the most dominant ones with very distinct plumages. So these early migrants will have a really huge variety of plumage types where you'll have things still in breeding plumage but failed and they're coming south, some like halfway through their molt, some all the way into non-breeding plumage, and then you get the juvenile plumage as well. When you're looking for shorebirds, the best place to look is the outer islands with very few trees. We have lots of falcons, especially during fall migration in Georgian Bay, and they like to nail shorebirds. We've seen a couple predated shorebirds on outer islands. So the ones with trees have more cover for the predators and less cover for the prey. Whereas the ones with very few trees means there's not a lot of places for predators to hide, and the shorebirds are a little bit safer. So the best place, I mean, if you see a tree on an island, it's probably better to try another place without too many. Then we get into our kind of typical fall migrants. And I put fall in quotation marks because, I mean, it's August, September. So these are the ones that you would think of as fall migrants, but fall migration doesn't start in our true fall. These are our warblers and sparrows. This is a pine warbler in its juvenile or non-breeding plumage. Normally they're nice and bright yellow. This guy is not, because it's the fall. And like I talked about earlier, they don't have their breeding plumage in fall. So you get much drabber birds. They group in these mixed flocks. So you'll see kinglets, you'll see chickadees, you'll see nuthatches, you'll see warblers, all in the same flock. And sometimes you'll have, 10 to 15 species in total. And this, creates two things. It creates a lot of difficulty because you need to know a variety of birds to be able to pinpoint them to species, but it also creates a huge potential for a lot of different species and some rare species to get mixed in, because they just kind of accumulate where they were breeding, and then they'll move south as a group. And again, I would recommend looking at a field guide before fall migration to look at these different plumages, because they can be quite challenging and some birds look very, very different. For these typical fall migrants, your best bet is wooded areas or edge habitats. Sparrows seem to like grassy areas, places where like rice cut grass was, places where there were lots of goldenrod or asters will be places where sparrows kind of like to spend their time. But warblers and chickadees like to be in the canopy. They like to glean insects off the leaves. And so you're going to be looking up in the trees and ideally along an edge habitat because it makes it easier for you as a birder. When you're on a rock barren and the birds are all in the trees, it's easier to look where there's less leaves. Whereas if you're in the middle of the woods, you're looking through a lot of things to see the birds. And in fall, we have to contend with tons of leaves, which is something you don't need to work with in the spring, because leaf out is usually pretty close to when birds are moving through. So you're not going to have to spend a lot of time looking around leaves. And then we have our late migrants. So these are ones that come through the end of September and October. These are hawks and eagles, our waterfowl. So in this picture is a pair of surf scoters that were photographed on Tuesday, moving through. So that's start of October. And when we're looking for late migrants, you're going to want to look to the shorelines and to the skies. And I'm going to break that down month to month. But when you're looking at ducks, especially, the more water you can view, the more ducks you might be able to see. So late migrants you switch from looking into the forest to looking more to the sky and to the different shorelines. It's also when we have these huge hawk migrations. If you've ever checked numbers at like Hawk Cliff or some of like the Niagara Escarpment, you can see, thousands of hawks moving through in a single day. So this may be hard to see depending on what size screen you have. But this is a sample checklist from this fall. And I'm going to break down the good stuff, so you don't need to squint and read it all. But I can also have Sarah send out the link to the checklist if people want to view it in all its detail. And the reason I bring this up is because this is, a good day in fall, and I got 46 different species. There's also +7 other taxa, which are basically things that I listed as like a hawk species or a gull species that were too distant to be able to identify. And in total, I saw 3,643 birds that day, which is a lot, especially for Georgian Bay. So this really shows what you can see in fall migration if you're prepared for it and you do a little bit of research ahead of time. So the highlights from this day was a single snow goose in a flock of Canada geese, I saw 1,970 Canada geese. There was some sandhill cranes flying over, 17 loons. And then when we get down to the raptors, I had 29 turkey vultures, an osprey, a northern harrier, 4 sharp-shinned hawks, a Cooper's hawk, 4 bald eagles, 330 broad-winged hawks, 26 red-tailed hawks, and 33 unidentified hawks. The other number I will point out is 1,082 blue jays, which is a really high number and was the high count in Muskoka for a grand total of 1 day, because the day after this, I saw 2,896 blue jays migrate over my cottage before noon. So this checklist was done at my cottage. This was me sitting on the porch, counting what birds were flying overhead. So you don't need to go very far to be able to see, you know, almost 4,000 birds. It just requires a little bit of prep. And to do this prep, well, timing is key. And this is a photo of part of a kettle of broad-winged hawks on that day. So this kettle was 160 hawks in total. So I was sitting on the point with a chair that leans way back so that I could look up at the sky with very little issue to my neck. And I happened to look behind me. These had actually flown over, or they had come in a weird direction. I don't know where they came from, but I looked behind me and there was 160 hawks in the sky circling. And I took a bunch of photos because it was just an incredible sight to see that many hawks in one place. And they circled, riding the thermals, and then just bombed south. So this was part of that 330, like almost half the hawks in this one kettle that I saw that day. And when I was preparing for this day, I spent about a week looking at an app called Windy. And for those of you who want to maximize your birding, I would highly recommend it. A lot of birders use this app. So this is a screenshot of it. It doesn't actually show the movement, but the app shows the movement of wind and the strength of wind. So each of those lines, it'll be shorter lines if it's quieter wind. So you can see some of the kind of stuff near Go Home Bay is a bit quieter, whereas the stuff out on the bay is a bit stronger. It shows the direction and it gives you a forecast. So you can hit the play button on the app and it'll actually forecast the winds. I think it has like 14-day forecast, but obviously it's only ever really worth it to go probably a week in advance. And so this is taken today, forecasting the winds across Georgian Bay. And this was taken at 2 p.m. So before that really good birding day, I spent a week checking winds, looking for really strong northwest winds, because that's what hawks love. And I knew I wanted to do a hawk watch. So I was looking at Wednesday looks good. Wednesday next week looks good. I checked it every single day. On Sunday, Wednesday was still looking good. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday was looking like it was just going to be incredible. The winds were going to switch to northwest overnight and be warm enough that hawks were going to ride the thermals up and then start migrating south. And, you know, I saw almost 4,000 birds that day. So it clearly was quite a good day. The other neat thing about Windy is you can get, I'm not shilling for Windy. This is just a useful app to use. You can use Weather Canada and other stuff. I just find it has all the stuff in one place. So this little thundercloud is the weather radar. So you can actually switch it to a weather radar view where you can see where the fronts are and see where the clouds are coming in, which is super useful if you're thinking about taking a 20 to an outer island and you're not sure when the rain's going to hit or if it's going to hit. So you can get the weather forecast as well. And there's a ton of tools on here. So you can actually change the height at what you're looking at the winds. So you can look at winds 2 kilometers above the surface. You can look at them 6 kilometers above, because different birds will migrate at different heights. You can check wind gusts. You can check dew point temperatures. There's probably more features than you'll ever need, but it's an incredibly useful app for bird watching. And it's probably the most used weather app for bird watchers in Ontario. And I think you can also view it on the desktop as well. And it's literally just called Windy. There's nothing else. So I now when I was preparing this presentation, I wasn't sure how to break down fall migration. I think I did a spring migration talk and I broke it down into groups of birds. And so I thought, well, maybe I could talk about common migrant species you might see. But when you look at my checklist of 46 different species, if I were to teach you even 10 of those, it's highly unlikely you'd remember those 10 come next fall or even come a week from now. So I thought species is maybe too specific. So do I go to groups of species? And I realized that groups of species has a different issue in that if I teach you how to identify a warbler, there's only about a month you can use that information before they kind of migrate through. Same with sparrows, same with hawks. You have like a very short window to be able to ID hawks. So groups of species aren't super useful. So I decided on a monthly breakdown and I made it really simple. And I said, what would I do, or what did I do this year in each of these months? And what am I still doing? And you can take as much or as little from that as you want. Some people might want to focus on specific species. So maybe there's only a couple weeks that they care about. But this is like my game plan. When breeding season is over, June is winding up, this is my game plan going into fall migration to see as many species as possible. So it starts in, oh, and I should mention what species this is. This is an American golden plover. And there is about, I would say, a week to 2 week period that you'll see these along the coast of Georgian Bay. They're one of our latest shorebirds that are migrating through. So this is a plover, shorter bill, and quite rare. I've only actually seen this twice, and I think we have less than 10 records for Muskoka County in all time. This shorebird is a sanderling. This is one that is super common in fall migration, somewhat rare in spring migration, but it likes the Georgian Bay coast because it really likes tidal action. So it likes wave action. And a lot of other places, inland Muskoka, inland Parry Sound, probably even inland Simcoe, you don't see as much wave action because they don't have as large wave areas like we have on Georgian Bay and like they have on some of the other Great Lakes. So sanderlings love this because they like to run with the waves. And this was photographed in July, I think 2 years ago. And this is it kind of molting out of its breeding plumage. So in July, my plan for migrants is outer islands for shorebirds. That's pretty much all I'm doing. There's not a lot of hawks migrating. There's not a lot of warblers. Most birds are on nest with eggs or with young. They're feeding them. They've got a lot of things to worry about, and migrating is not one of them. Shorebirds, however, if they fail their nest, they start moving south. So you'll see things like a group of sanderling. You'll see black-bellied plovers, maybe. You'll see yellowlegs. And weather tends to be a bit of less of an issue in July. My rule for July is if I can get out, I go out. So we take a 20 to outer islands because it's easier to get closer to the birds. And often the islands that shorebirds like are shared by gull nesting colonies. And you do not want to land at a gull nesting colony because it's not a fun experience. In April, we had a gulls on nest and there was a vessel that had run up aground. So we rescued the motor and handed it to the OPP. But I had to disturb the gull colony when we were getting the motor. And we got dive bombed and screamed at, and it's just not a fun experience for anyone involved. So I usually recommend taking a smaller boat if you want to go birding so you can get nice and close to the birds, and just go when you can, because shorebirds, the rule of thumb for shorebirds is they migrate before fronts, they migrate at night, and they like northwest winds. However, that's not a hard and fast rule, and I've seen them out there in all types of weather, all types of winds, and I would just, if you see an opportunity to go out, go out. And then my final point is if you see a lot of shorebirds. So if you see 100 shorebirds on one island, it's probably there's a good chance that a lot of shorebirds dropped for whatever reason. Maybe rain set in and they decided they needed to land and refuel. Maybe the weather just turned and they said, we want better winds, we're going to stop over here. But if you see shorebirds on one island, check all the islands that you can, or that you have the gas for, or the confidence to, because often you're going quite close to shoals when you're checking these islands out. But July is all about shorebirds for me. I mean, I'm still doing a little bit of breeding bird work, but if I'm looking for migrants, it's pretty much only shorebirds. And then August, I call it Listen for Chickadees month. So this is when those mixed flocks start forming, when the warblers and chickadees start grouping. And the interesting thing about these mixed flocks is the birds are pretty much silent for most of the time, except for chickadees. Chickadees are always talking. So if you hear chickadees, there's a good chance that there's a bunch of other birds with them. They're just being really quiet. So listen for chickadees. And basically, my binoculars are always next to me. And when I hear chickadees, I grab them and I run out the door. And I start looking for where the flock is. You can make it really easy for yourself to find these flocks if you figure out the migration lines around your cottage or around areas you want to bird, because the birds tend to travel in at my cottage, they're one of 4 lines that they use. So they tend to use the same route as they're moving past your cottage. So figuring out what that line is allows you to predict where they're going to move. And predicting where they're going to move is much easier to get good looks at the birds instead of like just finding the flock, because the flock is always going to be moving. And if you are ahead of it, you're going to be able to watch it pass right by you and see it for the full duration as opposed to just a portion. Often you don't even need to leave your cottage. I mean, you have to go outside your cottage, but you don't need to boat to any other area to see these flocks. They're constantly moving down the shoreline of Georgian Bay. They're constantly moving, like your house, your cottage, they'll be moving anywhere. We have a bunch that move interior Bracebridge. We have tons that move by our cottage. Anywhere you are, you're going to see these flocks. The caveat to all this is this bird in this picture is a bedraggled and molting magnolia warbler, which is not readily apparent because it's kind of halfway between its breeding and non-breeding plumage. So birds are molting. They're going to look funny. There should be a really bright white bar on this bird's wing, which is kind of just barely there. The streaking on the breast should be much more distinct. It's not really, because this bird's in the middle of a molt and it's losing some feathers and it's keeping others. So in August, if you're not finding a ton of shorebirds in July, my advice, check out your fall warbler plumages, because they're called CFWs, or confusing fall warblers, for a reason. And then September is my month to be eyes to the skies. So this is your hawk watch month. This is when rare gulls might start showing up. This is when terns are accumulating. So this was actually photographed with Sarah. Sarah and I were doing a property visit, and all these terns were staging on some outer rocks. And so I forced Sarah to boat by all these rocks so that I could photograph the terns in case there were some interesting terns in there. There were Caspian and common terns. The Caspian are the larger terns. The common terns are the smaller ones. And I think I pretty much photographed every possible plumage variation of both of the species. There wasn't anything rarer than that, but it's always good to check. So this is the month you really have to pay attention to those northwest winds. So I had 2 really, really good days of hawk watching this year, and a third that I missed because I wasn't paying attention, most likely. So I had one day where I had a kettle of about 30 broad-winged hawks and a golden eagle fly over the cottage. The golden eagle being quite a rare migrant through the region. And I only spent about an hour hawk watching that day. And what I should have done is spent the whole day hawk watching. So pay attention to the weather, pay attention to those wind directions and the strength, because that's going to be that you're going to be able to predict exactly when hawks are moving. Usually in Go Home Bay or in the Muskoka region of Georgian Bay, it's around middle September. Parry Sound, it's going to be probably a bit earlier. South of that, it's going to be a bit later. But there's some historic records from Christopher Harris, another amazing birder, from about, I don't know, 30 years ago, where he had, I think, 1,500 broad-winged hawks move by his cottage in one day. So those weather predictions are super key in getting a really good hawk watch day. The last thing I'll recommend is study hawk and eagle shapes. You know, the silhouettes that we used to paste on our windows to stop birds from hitting them? Well, you can ID a hawk just from a silhouette. I'm not good enough to do that because I don't look at enough hawks in flight. But if you study the shapes, you can instantly narrow it down to probably a couple species. You're looking like bald eagles and golden eagles, you can ID just based off their wing shape. Bald eagles have these really rectangular wings that look like a plank. Golden eagles have more rounded wings and they soar with their wings slightly raised. So there's a lot you can do with wing shape, the number of kind of fingers or feathers they have sticking out. So study those hawk and eagle shapes prior to September, and you'll have a much better chance of IDing these hawks as they're moving over, because you're never going to see, well, you will see hawks sitting in September, but most of the hawks you see are going to be moving above you. So get a comfortable chair, learn those shapes, because you're not going to see much more than the shape of the bird in a lot of cases. And then we get to our final month. Now, October/November is probably the better rule of thumb because they're pretty similar. October just has some more of those last migrants coming through, where the end of October, November, you're going to get some just odd stuff showing up. So this is an American kestrel perched on the southeast wooded pine island, was hunting some sparrows most likely. And my recommendation for October is find a good vantage point that you can scan a lot of water, because waterfowl start showing up in October. And the more water you can see, the more waterfowl you can see. It's just simply that simple. If you're looking across, at a 100-meter stretch of water, there's not a lot of waterfowl you can see. If you're looking at a couple kilometers of water, you've got a much bigger chance. October is where your glassware is slightly more important, and that being your binoculars and or a spotting scope. But you can help yourself in a lot of ways. I often, if it's a quiet day, will go to one of the islands where I watch shorebirds, and it's a bit raised, so you can see for several kilometers out, and you can get a really good vantage point. And when you're raised, you're above any shimmer that might occur from temperature differences between the water and the air. So you can maximize your viewing potential from some of the outer islands where you get to see the whole skyline and a bunch of water. And October is still really good for that because the shimmer is down, even if you're viewing like from a lower surface. Once you get into November or like early April in the new year, it's a lot harder to fight with that shimmer because the shimmer is more present because the water temperature is much different from the air temperature. My other advice for October, photograph everything possible. Anything that looks kind of weird, take a photo of it, because this is when we get variegated flycatchers from like Mexico. It's when we get Western kingbirds. It's when we get Anna's hummingbirds. It's when we get Swainson's hawk. All these weird birds show up in Ontario and many other places because of weather patterns, like the hurricane, unfortunate hurricane that hit the East Coast also brought a lot of pelagic birds inland that people were able to see. There were people that predicted exactly where all the pelagics were going to show up and had like 20 species of pelagics in a day. Pelagics being kind of like our seafaring birds. And we've had them inland, and it's just a matter of, being where they are flying by. So photograph anything that looks kind of odd. 9 times out of 10, it's just something that looks kind of odd, but you get the occasional super rarity when you're photographing stuff. And then actually the one other thing I should add about this kind of weird species showing up is, and this is a whole nother webinar topic, but it has to do with the way birds navigate. So it's to do with vagrancy in birds. And usually the case is they have a magnetic compass to tell north from south. And sometimes the genetics, like they'll have a little error in the genetic code that flips that compass. So when they want to start migrating south, like they're supposed to, their genetics say, no, go north. Your north is the direction you want to go. And so they end up overshooting and landing in Ontario. So yeah, October is the month where a bunch of weird birds show up. And then my last advice is keep your hummingbird feeders up. They're not gonna, the common misconception is that birds are staying there because there's food. That's not the case. Like I said, hummingbirds have a bunch of different compasses and things that tell them when to migrate. It's not because there's food there. It's, time of day, temperature. There's a lot of things that go into migration, and keeping hummingbird feeders are not going to keep your resident hummingbirds there. What they're going to do is when that Anna's hummingbird gets blown off course from British Columbia and ends up in Ontario, it's going to give it a food source because there's not a lot of flowers around in October. So keep your hummingbird feeders up. I usually put ours away when we close the cottage. So, and the greatest thing is you're more likely to see a rare hummingbird in October than a ruby-throated hummingbird, which is our resident one in many cases. So if you see a hummingbird in October, especially like mid to late October, there's a good chance it's something pretty odd. So to wrap up all this, so I can open it up for some questions, is the way I bird fall migration is July is shorebirds, outer islands, figuring out where those shorebirds are and catching the early shorebirds migrating south. August, that's a month you can just chill at your cottage. You can go swimming, you can canoe around, and you can just watch all the flocks of warblers migrating right by your cottage. September, eyes to the sky, look for your hawks, your geese, blue jays. Anything that migrates during the day is often going to be migrating during September. And then October is where you turn to the open water and try to see as much waterfowl as possible. Now, there are some, exceptions to the rule. This little guy is called a Lapland longspur. They breed up on the tundra, and for some reason, they love outer islands. Lapland longspurs, horned larks, American pipits, you see them on outer islands more than anywhere else in Georgian Bay, and they usually pass through at the end of September and start of October. So this is one of those birds that, if you're still looking for shorebirds in September, which is still a pretty good idea, you might happen upon one of these as well. So I'd like to open it up for questions with the final photo of a lovely Bonaparte skull that we saw during fall migration this year. It was one of 3 that we photographed on some of the outer islands while we were looking for shorebirds. So another little neat bird that you might see when you're just looking for other stuff.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was fantastic information. And I'm sure there's lots of questions. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box and I will read those out to Aaron. So we've got a first question here from Janet. Have you seen any nighthawks this year? And what roughly is the impact of duck hunting on the duck population?
So I'll answer the nighthawk question first. I have seen them. I've found their nests and I've seen their young. Nighthawks, like we have tons of whippoorwills. Nighthawks seem to be not doing quite as well as the whippoorwills, at least in Go Home are. But they're also a bit harder to detect because they don't have that really obvious whippoorwill call. Their call is like wah, wah, all night. And often they'll just do it at dawn or dusk when they're like hawking insects. So I remember there was someone in our cottage club who had probably a nighthawk nest about 1 kilometer from his cottage, who had seen his first one in the fall because they're a bit more active kind of when they have their young, and they said that he saw his first nighthawk in the fall. And I said, well, they've actually been there all summer. You just haven't seen them because they're I've been hearing them all summer, but you just haven't been seeing them. So they're a little bit harder to detect than whippoorwills. So they're still definitely present, but not quite in the same numbers. And I have seen them day flying, but it was more often inland away from cottages and later in the season. So I think it was like August when I saw about 3 or 4 of them day flying. As for duck hunting, that's probably a pretty nuanced issue. What I will say about that is there tends to be, I mean, most bird populations are declining. The largest impact to bird populations is habitat degradation and outdoor cats. And I would say those probably have a larger impact on the populations, or at least habitat degradation probably has a larger impact than hunting does on duck populations, to answer the nuanced issue of duck hunting.
Another question from Jane. How do you count such large numbers in flocks?
So actually, I can't zoom in on that slide, but I can probably get you to, Sarah, to send my checklist around. And what I did is I counted the flocks as they migrated over. And I just entered that one into that number into the comments of eBird with a comma after it. And then I entered the next flock, comma, and just added flocks as I came in. So there's, under the Canada geese, which is like 2,000 some individuals, there's like one, because the first one was just a lone bird. And then it's like 44, because then there was a flock of 44, and then like 35 and 26. And I was just counting the number in each flock as they were flying overhead.
And are you able to get the actual numbers, or do you have to do like an estimate sometimes?
So I've had to do on that checklist. I did an estimate once of broad-winged hawks because I couldn't count that 160 fast enough. And I did one Canada goose estimate because they were flying so far away and so densely packed that I couldn't count individual birds. But I count by threes. Some people count by twos, some people count by fives. My brain just for some reason chose 3 as the way to count. So of course I have all these like 3, 6, 9, 12, and like really odd numbers, like when I get up to 51 and stuff. But that's just like, I count by threes. So as they're passing over, I just start counting, and I count the first 3, 3, 6, 9, 12. And once you kind of get into a rhythm of it, it's a lot, it's pretty easy to actually count them pretty rapidly.
Okay. Jane says, you mentioned some birds that I thought stayed all year. For example, blue jays, turkey vultures, chickadees. What is considered migration?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So turkey vultures definitely migrate, but they're also here like almost all year. Like I think we were down in Niagara bird watching on like January 4th or something one year, and we had a turkey vulture. So they're pretty much resident. I wouldn't say they're resident in Georgian Bay all year. I would say they stay till quite late and they come quite early. But I don't think they're resident. Chickadees are fairly resident. Blue jays are migratory in the sense that we see them all year, but the population we see in the winter is different than the population we see in the summer. Like our summer blue jays migrate south, and we get northern blue jays coming down to us. So there is a migration. You just don't notice it as easily because they're always around. But our summer blue jays actually migrate south, and we just get the northern ones that stay during the winter. And how you would tell if something's resident, I would honestly just, the easiest thing I can say is look at a species map. Usually they have a year-round population marker, and it just shows where the year-round population is.
Okay.
But yeah, chickadees are resident, though I kind of see them migrating right now. So I don't really know what's up with that, but I've seen like flocks of 40 and 50 of just chickadees in the last few days. And I'm going to be digging a little bit deeper into seeing whether that's like a winter survival thing that they're prepping for, or if there is like some amount of chickadee migration.
Okay, interesting. Bonnie asks, when you mentioned watching for northwest winds, what specifically are we watching for? Is it high winds, moderate winds, or what are you looking for?
I mean, you don't want anything crazy high, because if it's like gale force, the birds probably won't be moving in it. But I think the day I hawk watched, it was something like 20 to 25 kilometers per hour. So like reasonably strong winds, but not gale force. And honestly, they'll move with quieter winds than that too. So the direction matters a bit more than the speed, really, in a lot of cases. Like anything between probably 10 to 25 is they'll be moving in.
Okay. John is wondering, in fall migration, given that flight is during the night, when is the best time for observation?
I mean, so there are a lot of small birds migrate at night, but all the hawks and like vultures and geese and blue jays will migrate during the day. So in September, there's a lot of day migration that you can watch. In August, when it's smaller birds, I tend to have, well, there's always a flock at my cottage. And sometimes it passes through at like 9 a.m. Sometimes it's noon and sometimes it's like 2 p.m. So again, that's just like listen for the chickadees because they're going to tell you where the birds are. And it, that's when I go out to go bird watching, at least at my cottage. Birds tend to be a bit more active in the morning, so that's usually a good bet. But in fall, like all bets are off. Like I've had flocks pass through at 4 p.m. We had a huge flock early in the fall, probably 200 to 300 warblers in one flock passing through at 7 p.m. on an outer island. Like, and I wouldn't have expected to see that at 7 p.m., but there you go. They were all super dark. You couldn't ID half the birds, but they were moving at that point. So yeah, it's pretty variable in the fall, but again, the listen for chickadees is kind of the key takeaway there, because they're going to tell you where everything else is.
Okay. There's just a question from someone wondering where your cottage is, Aaron. Where are you seeing all this?
Yeah, so our cottage is Go Home Bay. It's in the inner bay of Go Home Bay. So it doesn't actually have a lot of open water in front of it. It has, like, we're on the shoreline, but we're on like an interior shoreline, so in a bay. And I mean, if you're too far out, you're not going to get too many flocks of warblers because they like to be right along the shoreline. If you're too interior, you're going to have probably less hawks because hawks, again, like to be right on the shoreline. But as long as you're like near some amount of shoreline with your cottage, you should be pretty good because shorelines themselves are edge habitat. So, I mean, mine is all done at Go Home Bay, but I've seen, incredible numbers from other areas as well. And like I visited our Port Severn wetlands property a couple times this fall, and I have seen sparrows there like I've never seen elsewhere. Just so many sparrows. And that's like a coastal wetland right down in Port Severn. So yeah, as shorelines are usually a good bet during fall migration, but you're going to see them moving everywhere. My mom kept telling me, I kept receiving texts from her because she was in Bracebridge at the time saying, oh, I just had like 15 species of warblers in the yard. And I'm like, oh, that's great. So, I mean, yeah, anywhere is going to be good. But yeah, for me specifically, it's Go Home.
Okay. Bill's wondering, he says, it seems that some portion of Bufflehead and Goldeneye follow the snow or ice lines south in the fall and vice versa in the spring at Go Home. He's seen them in Go Home in early December, which seems very late, or is this usual for these species?
No, they're pretty late ducks. I mean, ducks are kind of weird. We saw surf scoters 2 days ago and I did not expect to see them. But then we also saw like a flock on Monday. So 3 days ago, we saw a flock up in Perry Sound. So buffleheads and golden eyes basically will use any amount of open water. So anywhere in Georgian Bay that's open, they're going to be using. They tend to be a little bit later. Buffleheads and goldeneye, I think we usually see kind of end of October, early November. But the interesting thing with them is they kind of like slightly smaller bodies of water. So I think they actually like being in the bay once ice has come in a little bit, but they like kind of interior lakes until that happens. I think the bay is, I don't know, maybe too rough for them. I've been out in kind of middle of October and I've scoped the bay until the ice sets in, and usually I only see them when there's a little bit more ice on the lake.
Okay. Jill says she noticed 2 eagles in the osprey nest off Bosley about 2 weeks ago, and she's wondering if they will take over the osprey nest next year.
That's a good question, and I don't know. So I talked to Jane Ann Campbell, who's up in Sans Souci, and one of her osprey nests were taken over by eagles. And it really has to kind of do with the fact that we just have more eagles around now. Like their population was quite low and it's rebounding. And I mean, osprey nests are kind of like where they would build their nests normally. Like they like high pine trees. Normally I would think that they'd like a bit more cover than a nesting platform, but I mean, with the increased traffic and the fact that they're so isolated, like a nesting platform is probably equally good for them. So it's probably going to depend on who gets there first, whether if the eagles stick around in winter and like lay first claim, they're probably going to kick the ospreys out. But if they migrate more southward and the ospreys get there first in the spring, then the ospreys may keep it. But yeah, it's kind of anyone's guess at this point, but it would be good to keep an eye on that to see what actually happens.
Okay, yeah, let us know, Jill. Okay, we've got a question from Peter and Jag, who are wondering, they're moving to the Bruce Peninsula, Owen Sound area next summer. They currently live in Niagara, and they're wondering how different it will be in terms of the birds they'll see. And specifically, will they still see orioles?
Yeah, you'll definitely still see orioles. I've found in Georgian Bay, the orioles, I don't know where they breed, but they come through during migration, but I don't see them stick around during breeding season. So I don't know if that's because they're breeding more interior or they're, looking for a more, I don't know, alder swamp, wetland habitat or, wetland edge habitat. So they're breeding more interior and not along the shorelines. But we usually see a couple at the cottage in the spring, and then they go somewhere else for most of the breeding season. As for whether it's going to be similar to Niagara, probably it'll be you'll see similar birds. Niagara has a much larger chance for rare gulls. You probably see a lot more rare waterfowl there. But Bruce, you might have more options for shorebirds because of the way the Bruce Peninsula works. I see, a fair number of shorebirds on some of like those limestone alvar sections. You'll probably have less birds than Niagara. Niagara tends to accumulate birds in the winter, whereas you're definitely not seeing a huge accumulation of birds in Georgian Bay or the Bruce Peninsula during the winter. So your winter birding will probably change, but your spring, summer, fall birding will probably be somewhat similar, maybe a few less rarities.
Okay, thanks.
And actually, the other thing I should add is more northern birds. You'll get more finches.
Okay. Jane Ann is wondering, how do we learn migration routes at our cottage, and how best to study raptor silhouettes?
Yeah, so for the migration routes, it's just spend your time like watching how the flocks are moving. So when you're starting, you hear the chickadees, you go outside and you watch the direction. So okay, let me backtrack. When a flock moves, it doesn't move as one big whole thing, right? There's some leaders and there's some trailers, and then there's the majority of the flock. So when you hear the chickadees, you'll usually find the flock for the middle of the flock. So you'll be able to see where birds are coming from and see where birds are going to. So what you do is you just like keep going out every time you see chickadees and watching the way they're moving. And usually you'll find that they're moving in a very similar pattern. So we have 4 migration routes on our cottage. So we have one in front of the cottage that they don't use too often, but there's a few flocks that use it. There's one that goes behind the cottage and then down to the shoreline. There's one that goes over the wood pile. And then there's one that goes down a hydrocut. So hydrocuts are good places to start, but really find the chickadees and watch where the birds are coming from and where they're going to. And it'll give you a really good idea as to where the usual paths that they take. And then studying hawk silhouettes. There's a couple like Raptors in Flight books. I think some of the field guides have really good silhouettes. And I think you can just do some good like I would find a field guide with raptors in flight section. That's probably the best thing to do. Find the raptors in flight section of a field guide. I think National Geographic has a good one. I think Peterson might have a good one. And then work with that, because you'll get the silhouette. It'll just be colored. And, you know, sometimes you see the hawk in color. I have been contemplating starting like a database with hawk silhouettes, because I take really bad photos. So they're all silhouettes. And then being able to quiz yourself on like a randomly selected silhouette. But that's like in the pipeline, maybe something in the future that might be available. But right now I would say find a good field guide and learn the silhouettes from any good field guide. Should have a hawk and flight section, and just use those.
Okay, thanks. And our last question comes from Bonnie. She says, in Carling, we used to have tons of whippoorwills, but now we don't hear them at all. Have they moved farther north with climate change?
Yeah, whippoorwills are an interesting species. My guess is the forest has grown up too much. My guess, I don't think climate change is necessarily causing whippoorwill range contraction, I guess you could say. I think it probably has to do with, now this is just anecdotal personal thoughts. I haven't done any science to back this up, but I think it's because there used to be a lot more fires and logging. And now that the forests are growing up, the whippoorwills don't like that habitat anymore. So you're seeing the same thing in Muskoka, where areas like there used to be whippoorwills everywhere in Muskoka. They're only on the barrens now, because the barrens still have open forests and like meadow / rocket barren areas adjacent to it, where a lot of the rest of Muskoka is just seeing this grow up of forest, where the understory is getting too thick and there isn't the open spaces they need to feed, which is why Georgian Bay still has a lot of whippoorwills. It's why Torrance Barren has a lot of whippoorwills, and the rock barrens have whippoorwills. But why we're seeing, or my guess is why we're seeing a decline in forested areas that used to have a lot of whippoorwill.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's all our questions. Thank you again, Aaron, for this amazing talk. Before we go, I'm just going to hand it over to our coworker, Janet, who has a few final words.
Thanks, Aaron. Your knowledge is just absolutely astonishing every time we listen to you. So I know that I'm going to just speak right now on Aaron's behalf. We're going to continue with these bird seminars next year for sure. So maybe if those who are listening right now would like to give us some topics perhaps of what would be of most interest, please put them in the chat, and we'll take a look at it for next year. Not to put you on the spot or anything there, Aaron. I just want to let everybody know that our next big event is Bayscapes. I'm sure you've already seen the notices of that. Our online auction opens on October 21st and closes October 29th with a live musical event. So please mark it in your calendars. We've got, once again, fabulous art experiences and very unique items this year. So we know you won't want to miss it. Next month, our guest speaker will be Scott Parent and his daughter Acadia, who will share their film Three Waters. And this is a journey that they did together from Drummond Island to Penetanguishene on a stand-up paddleboard while taking deep water samples, and collecting plastics on the way. So I'm just waiting for Scott for an actual confirmed date, but we'll keep you posted on that. And as this year starts to come to a close, we please ask that you consider adding the GBLT to your charitable giving list. And this is to ensure that we can all continue to continue our important work protecting the wilderness lands of Georgian Bay forever. That's it for now. Thanks for joining us for this great talk by Aaron. Thanks for joining us this evening, and we wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving with family and friends. Good night, and we'll see you in November.